Let me tell you about Backwater Station Delta-7, the galaxy's favorite punchline. Picture this, a ramshackle collection of prefab modules held together by hope, duct tape, and what the locals generously called creative engineering. The whole place looked like someone had sneezed while building a space station and decided to just roll with it. Commander Jake Murphy stood in his greenhouse, humming off-key while checking his prized tomato plants. At 42, Jake had the kind of face that suggested he'd seen some things but mostly chose to ignore them in favor of a good nap. His uniform was regulation, technically speaking. If you squinted and ignored the dirt stains and the fact that he'd replaced all the military patches with ones showing cartoon vegetables. "Commander," came a voice over the intercom, crackling with the distinctive sound of equipment that probably should have been replaced a decade ago. "We've got that weekly check-in from Earth Command." Jake sighed and picked a particularly red tomato. "Tell them we're still here, still growing food and still not dead. Same as last week." The voice belonged to Tommy Walsh, their communications officer, a 28-year-old who treated galactic diplomacy like a particularly boring video game. Tommy had joined the colonial service because, and I quote, "it seemed like the kind of job where nobody would bother me." He was mostly right. Down in the engineering section, Rosie Park was performing what she called percussive maintenance on their water recycling system. At 35, Rosie had the distinction of being the only person in 3-star systems who could make a coffee maker, a hydroponics pump, and a waste processor work in perfect harmony using nothing but spite and spare parts. "Jake," she called up through the ventilation system, because their intercom had given up the ghost last Tuesday. "The atmospheric processors are making that sound again." The good sound or the bad sound? The sound that means we're all breathing recycled farts, but at least we're breathing. Big Mike Rodriguez, their security chief, poked his head into the greenhouse. At 6'4" and built like a refrigerator that lifted weights, Mike had the kind of presence that usually ended bar fights before they started. The irony was that Mike was possibly the gentlest human being in known space, with a hobby of knitting sweaters for the station's cats. "Boss," Mike said, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone about to deliver news that wasn't technically bad but wasn't great either. "We just got word from the Traders Union. Apparently. We're officially listed in their database as that place where they grow okay vegetables and nobody important lives." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Could be worse. Remember when they called us that death trap where humans go to disappear?" "That was last month, boss." "Right. Progress." This was life on Delta-7. They grew food, they maintained their little corner of space, and they existed in that special category of places the galaxy had collectively decided weren't worth the effort to think about. The Galactic Council didn't invite them to meetings. Pirates didn't bother raiding them. Even the tax collectors had apparently forgotten they existed. It was, Jake often thought while tending his tomatoes, exactly the kind of life he'd always wanted. No drama, no politics, just him and his crew keeping a little piece of humanity running in the middle of nowhere. What Jake didn't know was that their peaceful, boring, completely unremarkable existence was about to become the galaxy's most expensive mistake. 300 light-years away, Admiral Vex'than of the Zephyrian Imperial Fleet was having what he considered a moment of pure strategic genius. Standing 7 feet tall with skin that shifted between purple and gold depending on his mood, Vex'than cut an impressive figure in his elaborate uniform that looked like someone had bedazzled a military outfit with the fury of 1,000 craft stores. "Behold," he announced to his assembled war council, gesturing dramatically at a holographic display, "the perfect target for our demonstration of Zephyrian supremacy." The display showed Delta-7 in all its ramshackle glory. His officers, a collection of beings who had perfected the art of looking interested while thinking about literally anything else, dutifully examined the image. "A human agricultural station," Vex'than continued, his voice rising with what he believed was inspirational fervor. "Isolated, defenseless, and populated by the weakest specimens of their species. Farmers, can you imagine? When we crush this pathetic outpost, humanity will tremble before our might." Sub-Commander Cree, who had the misfortune of being Vex'than's second in command, raised what might generously be called a hand. "Sir, wouldn't a military target provide a more substantial demonstration?" Vex'than's skin shifted to a particularly vibrant shade of gold, which among Zephyrians indicated the kind of confidence usually reserved for people about to make spectacular mistakes. Kriex, he said, shaking his head in disappointment. You think like a soldier, not like a strategist. We attack their weakest point, their most pathetic colony, and when it falls without resistance, every human world will know that even their safest havens are not safe from Zephyrian justice. The plan, as Vex'than explained it with increasing enthusiasm, was elegantly simple. They would jump into the system with overwhelming force, demand immediate surrender, and when the terrified farmers inevitably capitulated, they would broadcast the victory across every human communication network in the galaxy. Psychological warfare, Vex'than declared, apparently under the impression he had invented the concept. We break their spirit before we break their worlds. What made this plan particularly brilliant, in Vex'than's opinion, was the intelligence they had gathered on Delta-7. The station was commanded by a human who spent more time gardening than commanding. The crew consisted of a mechanic, a communications officer, and a security chief responsible for protecting vegetables. Their defenses were listed in the Galactic Registry as minimal to non-existent. Sir, ventured another officer, the humans have a reputation for unpredictability in combat situations. Vex'than waved dismissively. Propaganda and myth-making. These are farmers, not warriors. The closest they have come to combat is probably arguing over fertilizer shipments. As the Zephyrian fleet prepared to jump to Delta-7, Vex'than stood on his command deck, resplendent in his ceremonial armor, practicing the speech he would give when the humans surrendered. He had particularly high hopes for the part where he would magnanimously accept their unconditional capitulation while standing over their broken defenses. The fleet consisted of 12 heavy cruisers, 18 destroyers, and his flagship, the inevitable Conquest, a dreadnought that had never actually seen combat but looked very impressive in promotional materials. Today, Vex'than announced as they prepared to enter hyperspace, we begin the fall of humanity with their weakest link. It was, objectively speaking, a reasonable plan. It was also about to encounter the fundamental flaw in all reasonable plans: they assume reasonable opponents. The alarm on Delta-7 sounded like someone had taught a dying walrus to play the harmonica. Jake looked up from his tomatoes with the expression of a man who had heard this particular alarm exactly once before, during a drill that nobody had bothered to tell him was a drill. Boss?" Tommy's voice crackled through the failing intercom system. "We've got company. Big company. Like really big company." Jake wiped his hands on his apron, an actual apron with little peppers on it, and wandered over to the closest viewport. Outside, space had acquired a distinct lack of emptiness. Ships hung in the void like someone had parked a small city in their front yard. Jake said, with the tone usually reserved for discovering you're out of coffee. "That's new." The comm system suddenly burst to life with the kind of crystal-clear audio that suggested their visitors had better equipment than Delta-7's entire infrastructure budget. Pathetic humans of the agricultural station, boomed a voice that had clearly practiced this speech. "I am Admiral Vex'than of the Zephyrian Imperial Fleet. You are surrounded and defenseless. Surrender immediately, and your deaths will be swift." Jake looked around the greenhouse, noted that his crew had somehow materialized around him with the casual efficiency of people who had worked together too long, and shrugged. "Tommy, can you patch me through to Captain?" Jake paused. "What was his name again?" "Admiral Vex'than, boss." "Right, Admiral Vex'than." Jake activated the comm with the same energy most people reserved for ordering pizza. "Hey there, Admiral. This is Commander Murphy. Listen, I appreciate you stopping by, but we're kind of in the middle of harvest season. Could you maybe come back next month?" The silence that followed was the kind of silence that suggested several hundred alien minds attempting to process information that did not fit into any conceivable category. Did he just ask us to come back later?" Kriex whispered to Admiral Vex'than. Vex'than's skin had shifted to a color that wasn't on any known spectrum, which among Zephyrians typically indicated a complete system crash in the logic centers of the brain. "Human," Vex'than tried again. his voice rising to the pitch usually reserved for addressing particularly slow children. "You are about to be destroyed. This is not a social call." "Oh, I get that," Jake replied, examining a particularly nice tomato while he talked. "But see, we've got this delivery scheduled for next week, and if we don't make quota, the paperwork is just a nightmare. You understand how it is with bureaucracy, right?" While Jake was having what he apparently considered a perfectly normal conversation with an alien invasion fleet, Rosie had plugged her tablet into what passed for their sensor array and was running scans on the Zephyrian ships. "Well, this is interesting," she muttered, scrolling through data that would have made most military analysts weep with envy. "Their shields are running on a rotating frequency. Their weapons are powered by some kind of exotic matter that looks unstable as hell, and—" She paused, grinning. "Their entire fleet network is using the same encryption key." Big Mike was peering out the viewport with the expression of someone watching a mildly interesting sporting event. "Boss, they're powering up weapons." "Are they now?" Jake didn't look up from his plant. "Admiral, that's really not very neighborly of you." "Surrender or be destroyed," Vex'than bellowed, apparently having reached the end of his patience and most of his vocabulary. "Counteroffer," Jake replied, his voice maintaining that same infuriating calm. "How about you surrender? And I won't have to explain to Earth Command why I let a bunch of aliens blow up next week's vegetable shipment. Do you have any idea how much paperwork that would involve?" The silence this time lasted long enough for Tommy to start a betting pool on whether the aliens were going to have a collective aneurysm. "Rosie," Jake said, still not looking particularly concerned about the fleet of warships aimed at his greenhouse, "please tell me our mining equipment is still functional." "Define functional," Rosie replied, already pulling up schematics on her tablet. "The main excavator hasn't exploded in 6 months, the haulers only break down on days ending in Y, and the industrial fabricators work great as long as you don't mind everything coming out slightly radioactive." "Perfect. Mike, what's our defensive situation?" Big Mike consulted a clipboard that looked like it had survived several wars and possibly a small apocalypse. "Well, boss, we've got the perimeter sensors that work when they feel like it, 2 automated defense turrets that are currently being used as planters for Rosie's herb garden, and a really sturdy airlock." "And the mining charges?" "Oh, we've got plenty of those. Enough to move a small mountain, which is what we were planning to do next month anyway." Jake finally looked up from his tomatoes, and for just a moment, his expression suggested that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't quite as laid back as he appeared. "Tommy, please inform the Admiral that he has 60 seconds to withdraw his fleet before we get creative." Admiral Vex'than, monitoring the human communications with the growing suspicion that he had missed something important, watched as the supposedly helpless agricultural station began to change. What had appeared to be random industrial equipment suddenly started moving with purpose. Massive excavators that should have been used for mining began repositioning themselves with their business ends pointed toward space. The fabrication units, which intelligence had assured him were for processing crops, began producing objects that definitely were not vegetables. "Sir," Kree reported, his voice carrying the first hint of concern, "the humans are doing something with their mining equipment." "It's an agricultural station," Vex'than replied, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "What could they possibly—" He was interrupted by Tommy's voice crackling across the comm. "Admiral, this is your 30-second warning. Our commander is getting antsy, and when he gets antsy, things tend to explode in really interesting ways." On Delta-7, Jake was walking through the station with the casual air of someone conducting a routine inspection, except that his routine inspection involved checking the targeting systems on repurposed construction equipment. "Rosie, how's our power situation?" "Well, the good news is that fusion reactor has been running way under capacity for years because we never needed much power for growing vegetables," Rosie called back. "The bad news is it's about to find out what happens when we suddenly need enough power to turn farming equipment into improvised weapons of mass destruction." "And the mining charges?" "Loaded into the cargo launchers. You know, the ones designed to shoot raw ore into orbit? Turns out they're also really good at shooting other things into orbit, or into alien spaceships. Physics is funny that way." Big Mike had shed his usual gentle demeanor and was moving through the station with the efficient grace of someone who had definitely not spent his entire career growing vegetables. "Boss, I've got the defensive grid online. And by defensive grid, I mean I've convinced every piece of automated equipment on this station that those ships out there are really, really big weeds." Through the viewports, the Zephyrian fleet could see Delta-7 transforming from a sleepy agricultural station into something that looked suspiciously like a fortress designed by someone with a very skillful, creative definition of farming equipment. "Sir," another officer reported, his voice climbing toward panic, "they're targeting us with construction equipment." "That's impossible," Vex'than declared. "It's farming equipment." "Sir, I think that's the same thing." For the first time since arriving at Delta-7, Admiral Vex'than began to suspect that his intelligence reports might have been slightly incomplete. What happened next would later be studied in military academies across the galaxy as either a masterpiece of improvised defense or the most expensive practical joke in recorded history. At exactly 14:32 station time, Jake Murphy finished examining his last tomato, set it gently in a basket, and said the words that would echo through Zephyrian nightmares for generations. "Okay, folks, let's show these tourists how we do agriculture." The first surprise came when Delta-7's cargo launchers opened fire. These were, as he had mentioned, designed to launch raw ore into orbit for pickup by freighters. What the Zephyrians discovered was that when you load those launchers with mining charges and set them to high velocity, they become remarkably effective at delivering explosive presents to unwanted visitors. Evasive maneuvers. Admiral Vex'than screamed as his flagship shuddered under impacts that definitely shouldn't have been possible from farming equipment. The second surprise was Tommy Walsh's contribution to the defense. While everyone assumed he spent his time monitoring routine communications, Tommy had actually been practicing what he called aggressive networking. In the span of 30 seconds, he managed to hack into the Zephyrian fleet's communication system, their navigation computers, and their entertainment network. "Hey, Admiral," Tommy's voice suddenly echoed through every speaker on every Zephyrian ship. "I've taken the liberty of updating your music library. Hope you like death metal, because that's all your speakers are going to play for the next few hours." The third surprise was Rosie Park's engineering masterpiece. Those industrial fabricators that were supposed to process crops had been quietly modified over the years to handle more interesting projects. As the Zephyrian fleet watched in growing horror, Delta-7 began launching what appeared to be improvised missiles that somehow managed to target the exact weak points in their shield generators. "How are they doing this?" Crix demanded, watching his tactical display show system failures across the fleet. "I don't know," Vex'than replied, his carefully practiced composure completely abandoned. "The intelligence reports said they were farmers." "Maybe they're really good farmers?" suggested another officer. Big Mike's contribution was perhaps the most elegant. While the others were focused on long-range chaos, he had quietly activated Delta-7's automated defense grid. The station's numerous robots, normally used for maintenance and crop tending, that had been reprogrammed to treat the Zephyrian boarding pods exactly like the invasive pests they were designed to eliminate. The few Zephyrian soldiers who managed to breach the station's hull found themselves facing agricultural robots armed with pruning shears, pest control systems that redefined the concept of aggressive fumigation, and automated sprinkler systems that had been loaded with substances that definitely weren't water. But the real masterpiece was happening in the greenhouse. Jake Murphy stood among his tomato plants, calmly coordinating the defense while monitoring everything through a tablet that Rosie had somehow integrated with every system on the station. "Rosie, their shield generators are overheating. Tommy, see if you can convince their life support systems to play some relaxing nature sounds. Mike, I think the boarding party in Section C needs to meet our automated scarecrow." "On it, boss," came 3 simultaneous replies, 5 minutes into what would become known as the 7-Minute War. Admiral Vex'than made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Earth's weakest colony was systematically dismantling his fleet using nothing but spite, creativity, and agricultural equipment. 6 minutes in, half his ships were dead in space. His communications were playing something called Screaming Goat Compilation Volume 12, and his elite boarding teams were being chased through an agricultural station by robots that seemed personally offended by their presence. At 6 minutes and 30 seconds, Admiral Vex'than came to a conclusion that would have saved everyone a lot of trouble if he'd reached it earlier. He had made a terrible, terrible mistake. At exactly 7 minutes into what military historians would later call the Great Agricultural Incident, the Admiral Vex'than did something that had never been done in the proud history of the Zephyrian Imperial Fleet. He surrendered to a greenhouse. Stop. His voice crackled across every communication channel, competing with the death metal that Tommy had helpfully set to maximum volume. Please, for the love of all that is sacred in the cosmos, make it stop. Jake looked up from his tablet, where he had been monitoring the systematic destruction of one of the galaxy's most feared fleets, and glanced at his chronometer. 7 minutes, he said to nobody in particular. That's got to be some kind of record. Commander Murphy. Admiral Vex'than's voice had climbed to a pitch that suggested someone in the final stages of a complete psychological breakdown. I formally request an immediate ceasefire. We surrender. We surrender completely and unconditionally to your terrifying agricultural prowess. Jake activated the comm with the same casual energy he'd maintained throughout the entire encounter. Well, Admiral, I appreciate the sentiment, but you've kind of made a mess of my afternoon. Do you have any idea how hard it is to get good tomatoes in this sector? Through the chaos of alarms, emergency broadcasts, and what sounded like someone trying to sing opera while being attacked by angry geese, Admiral Vex'than managed to form words. What do you want? Resources? Territory? We can negotiate. Please, just make the robots stop chasing my boarding teams. Oh, that's easy enough, Jake replied. Mike, call off the scarecrows. I think our guests have learned their lesson about proper gardening etiquette. As the immediate chaos subsided and the Zephyrian fleet hung in space like a collection of very expensive paperweights, Jake finally revealed the secret that Earth Command had been keeping for decades. You know, Admiral, I appreciate you choosing our little station for your demonstration. Earth Command has been wondering for years how long it would take someone to attack what they kept calling our weakest colony. Jake's voice carried just a hint of amusement. Turns out, about 7 minutes to regret it. The truth, which Admiral Vex'than was beginning to understand with the horrible clarity of someone who had just learned they'd been spectacularly played, was that Delta-7 wasn't Earth's weakest colony. It was their testing ground. Every piece of agricultural equipment was a disguised military prototype. Every farmer was a retired military specialist. And Commander Jake Murphy, the laid-back tomato enthusiast, was a former admiral who had requested the assignment specifically because he wanted to see if Earth's new defensive concepts actually worked. The vegetables are real, though, Jake added helpfully. We grow some really excellent tomatoes. You should try them before you leave. As the Zephyrian fleet limped away from Delta-7, broadcasting warnings across every available channel about the humans' terrifying agricultural defenses, Jake returned to his greenhouse. He had, after all, interrupted his harvest to deal with visitors, and the tomatoes weren't going to pick themselves. Tommy was already composing the after-action report for Earth Command, which he planned to title How We Accidentally Conquered an Imperial Fleet While Gardening. Rosie was back in engineering, probably turning the coffee maker into some kind of defensive weapon just in case they had more visitors. And Big Mike was knitting what appeared to be a victory sweater for the station's cats. Just another day on humanity's weakest colony, where the vegetables were real, the farmers were retired military specialists, and the galaxy had just learned that attacking Earth's agricultural stations was a really, really bad idea. The last transmission Delta-7 received from the Zephyrian fleet was Admiral Vex'than's voice, small and defeated. Note to Fleet Command. Recommend immediate revision of intelligence protocols regarding human agricultural installations. Also, I'll request reassignment to desk duty. Preferably somewhere that doesn't involve actual humans. Jake smiled, picked another perfect tomato, and made a mental note to send a fruit basket to Earth Command. After all, it was important to maintain good relations with the folks who had trusted him to turn a vegetable garden into the galaxy's most effective psychological warfare operation. The moral of the story: as it would be told in alien military academies for generations, was simple: never underestimate humans, especially when they're being helpful. And definitely never attack their vegetables.